Today we are about to discuss the historical interpretation and multi-perspectivity. This is our learning objective for this particular concept or topic. First is for you to be able to recognize the multiplicity of interpretation from historical texts. Second, to identify the advantages and disadvantages of employing critical tools in interpreting historical events through primary sources. And lastly, to demonstrate ability to argue for or against a particular issue using primary sources. So let us begin. In this particular lesson, we will analyze three historical problems in Philippine history to apply what we have learned far in the work of historian and the process of historical inquiry. There are two key concepts that need to be defined before proceeding to the historical analysis of problems in history are these are interpretation and multi-perspectivity. Making sense of the past, historical interpretation. The first concept that we need to define is historical interpretation or interpretation itself. According to Geoffrey Barraclough, he defines history as the attempt to discover, based on fragmentary evidence, the significant things about the past. He also included that the history we read through based on facts is strictly speaking not factual but a series of concept and judgment. This judgment of historians on how the past should be seen make the foundation of historical interpretation. Historians utilizes facts from primary sources of history, and then they draw their own reading so that their intended audience may understand the historical event, a process that is essence make sense of the past. The premise is that not all primary sources are acceptable to the general audience, and without the proper training and background, a non-historian interpreting a primary source may do more harm than good. A primary source may even cause misunderstanding, sometimes even resulting to more problems. Interpretations of the past therefore vary according to who reads the primary source, when it was read, and how it was read. As a student of history, you must be well equipped to recognize different types of interpretation, why these may differ from each other, and how to critically shift this interpretation through historical evaluation. Interpretation of historical events change over time. Thus, it is important skill for a student to track these changes in an attempt to understand the past. Moving on, also in the concept of historical interpretation, many things we adapt as true, or many things we accept as true about the past might not be the case anymore, just because these were taught to us as a fact when we're younger does not mean that it is set in stone. History is, after all, a construct, and as construct, it is open for interpretation. On the other hand, there might be conflicting and competing accounts of the past that need one's attention and can impact the way we know our country's history and identity. It is very important to subject to evaluation not only the primary source but also the historical interpretation of the same. It is because to ensure that the current interpretation is reliable to support our acceptance of events of the past. Moving on, in the concept of multi-perspectivity, there are several possibilities of interpreting the past. Another important concept that we must note is the concept of multi-perspectivity. This multi-perspectivity defined as the way on looking at historical events, personalities, developments, cultures, and societies from different perspectives. This means that there is a multitude of ways by which we can view the world, and each could be equally validated and at the same time equally partially as well. Historical writing is, by definition, it can be biased, partial, and contains preconceptions. With the help of multi-perspectivity, the historian can decide on what sources to use, what interpretation to make, more apparent on what his end is. Also, the historians may misinterpret evidence, attending to those that suggest that a certain event happened and then ignore the rest that goes against the evidence. The historians may omit significant facts about the subject, which makes the interpretation unbalanced. In this concept, the historians may impose a certain ideology to their subject, which not be appropriate to the period the subject was from. Historians may also provide a single cause for an event without considering other possible causal explanations of the said events. There are many ways in which the historians may fall in his historical interference, description, and interpretation. So, with multi-perspectivity as an approach to history, we must understand that historical interpretations contains discrepancies, contradictions, ambiguities, and open to more focused dissent. Exploring multi-perspective in history requires us to incorporate sources or source materials that will reflect different views of an event in history because singular historical narratives that not provide for space to inquire and investigate. So that is why we need to look for another source or primary sources that might be able to help us in seeing various perspectives or various concepts that will lead us into the proper sequence of the events. And also, there are different kinds of sources that will provide historical truths. It is correct. These historical truths, these are an official document, may note different aspect of the past, like for instance a memoir of an ordinary person of the same event. Taking this close regard in the reading of historical interpretation, it improves the audience in more conflicts but also a more complete and richer understanding of the past. So that is why multi-perspectivity is very important in able for us to understand and to create our own historical interpretation more, I guess, more correct and more relevance into the into our audience. And also with the concept of historical interpretation and multi-perspectivity, we must be able to understand both concepts because this will lead us into examining and analyzing such primary sources that we had. So for today, that is all, and thank you so much for listening.